Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are still talking about dialogues written by Plato. We have moved away from the Socratic dialogues at this point, right? So the Apology and the Euthyphro were Socratic dialogues. They really focused on what Socrates believed and how he proceeded to do philosophy. Meno was a transitional piece. We're done with the Meno now. There seemed to be some Socratic elements and some Platonic elements. And now we're squarely in Plato's middle period with the Symposium. And I would say the views that Socrates promulgates here, the views that he shares in his speech near the end of the speeches, that contains Platonic doctrines. You see the theory of the forms play an important role in that speech, and that theory seems to belong to Plato, not to Socrates. Okay, in this video, what we want to do is to prepare the way for Socrates' speech. We're not going to cover it in this video. I'm going to give you some background information that will help you understand what a symposium is and what's going on in this symposium. And I will go ahead and discuss the speeches that are prior to the speech by Socrates. So we'll just sort of build up to that speech by Socrates, but we won't get into that today. So when I give the historical background, I'm leaning very heavily on Christopher Gill. So thank you, Christopher Gill. He's at the University of Exeter, and he wrote a wonderful introduction to the Penguin edition of the Symposium that I have made a lot of use of here in my notes, okay? So again, thank you, Christopher Gill. He's still going strong at the University of Exeter. Okay, so first of all, what is a symposium? It is somewhere between a dinner party and a drinking party, right? Supposing that the point of the dinner party is to have stimulating conversation, the point of the drinking party is to get drunk. This is a mix, right? This is a cultural event. It was common to give speeches, so this isn't an unusual thing that's happening, and there are lots of rules actually governing the speeches. So it was a well-developed cultural event with a rich background, but it often involved getting very drunk. It often involved competing to see who could drink the most, right? And as you will have noticed if you've read the Symposium already, the participants, the symposiasts, we could call them, they're already hungover from celebrating the previous evening, right? So these Greeks, they liked to drink, right? Going back in time, before Plato's time, the Symposium served to get aristocrats together, right? When the aristocrats had power, then they were at each other's throats. I mean, that's a healthy aristocracy, though that might sound odd. If it's healthy, then they're different centers of power, and so the aristocrats are jostling against each other, trying to get more power, right? And so there needed to be something to bring them together, to allow them to bond with each other, and the Symposium played that role. Now, of course, this takes place under democracy, right? But it could still play that role. You still get prominent figures. You still get people who get up in the assembly and give a lot of speeches and have a lot of sway, right? So it's still sort of playing that role, but perhaps it's highest moment has passed, because it played a really important role in keeping the aristocracy healthy, right? And it's clearly not playing that role anymore. Okay, as you could tell, the Greek Symposium is a male affair, right? All the symposiasts are male. It took place in the andron, which is the male part of the house, so even private houses of Greek citizens were segregated in this way. So there's a main room in the male part of the house, again called the andron, and the symposiasts are gathered there. Traditionally, young boys were allowed to be there, and they could watch, they could just observe. Sometimes they were cup bearers, so they would bring cups of wine to the participants, right? And then that was an important part of their training, because later they would participate in the symposia, right? That's the plural of symposium. So they might as well watch and see how it works, and later when they're more powerful and they're wielding power, then they can participate in the symposia and give speeches and whatever. Sometimes there were females present. There's a flute girl who's mentioned. The only females that were really allowed to attend were slaves and entertainers and prostitutes. You wouldn't allow, I'm sorry, it's a sexist society. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just reporting. You wouldn't let women in the household attend, right? They would have to stay away. Because it would be inappropriate. The Greeks would consider it inappropriate. Here's a bunch of guys getting drunk. You don't want to let your daughter or your wife around them. So, just entertainers and prostitutes and people like that. That would be okay. All right, so the topic of the symposium, as you know, presumably, is eros. Eros, the god of love. Phaedrus comes up with the idea of talking about eros. He has said apparently in the past, hey, there should be more talk about the god of love. There should be more speeches dedicated to the god of love. So Eryximachus is the one who officially proposes the topic, but he credits Phaedrus with being keen on this idea that we need to talk about love more. Eros has at least 3 distinct meanings that play an important role in the dialogue. So number 1, of course, Eros is one of the 2 gods of love, right? There's a sort of moving target when they give these speeches. So, they'll talk about the 2 gods of love as if they're equally important. But if we focus on the word eros, that refers to the younger of the 2 gods. So technically, eros is the son of Aphrodite, right? And then, again, this is a moving target. So the symposiasts end up arguing about the age of eros, but then at the same time, the specific god that they're talking about, when they decide to hone in on that god, is the son of Aphrodite. Although, other gods play a role here, and other meanings of eros that don't carry the meaning God play a role here too. In that vein, eros can mean desire in the broadest possible sense, right? So Eryximachus and Socrates both talk about eros in a liberal, broad way. Socrates is giving a speech that Diotima supposedly gave to him at one point in the past. And the point here is Eryximachus and Socrates both talk about eros in this really broad way. And so I'm just again, priming you into the different possible meanings of eros. Why would they talk about eros as if eros were equivalent to desire? Well, because that's just one of the meanings that eros has. Eros could be the desire for anything, and there's this theological background to the discussion that you're somewhat aware of, because we looked at some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, right? So we didn't look at the ones for whom love played a really prominent role, but we were certainly getting the idea from looking at the pre-Socratics that they talked about a lot of different cosmic forces that played a role in the development of the universe and how the universe functions, right? And some of the pre-Socratics made a big deal out of eros and how it's sort of a binding force in the universe as a whole, right? So that background is sort of peeking through here, I would say, at least in the speeches by Eryximachus and then Socrates as Diotima. I mean, he's kind of imitating her as he gives the speech, it seems. And then, of course, eros can mean passionate sexual desire, right? So it can mean this specific desire, something like lust. And then it will become important later that the Greeks liked to distinguish the passive and the active role in lovemaking. We need to say this so that we can understand what's going on. The Greeks tended to think that it was shameful for a male to play the passive role. So, yeah, their attitude to homosexuality is complicated, and so that'll be our next topic, actually, is to try to say something about that. But right now we're just clarifying that eros can mean sexual desire, and then, eros technically is more associated with the active part, because eros is a male god. Again, eros is the son of Aphrodite, right? So eros is the one that gets the active party going and excited, right? Although, again, the speakers complicate that. The language that I will fall back on here as a default is I'll talk about the lover and the beloved, right? So in the text, they're distinguishing between the active and the passive party because that was important to them, right? And then the translation here often talks about the lover and the boy, which is fair. However, part of what's at issue is what age is okay. What age can the beloved be? So I'll talk about the passive party as the beloved, and some of the participants think, you can't have the beloved be too young. Maybe the beloved should already have the beginnings of a beard, and that would be the most appropriate kind of relationship. So I'll stay away from the word boy, but not so much out of prudishness, but because that's part of what is at issue here. Like what is the appropriate age? So the lover will be the active party inspired by eros. The beloved will be the more passive party, right? And then I hope that will make it clear who has what role, right? Because that's important. The lover is supposed to have virtue, and the beloved is supposed to be gaining virtue by participating in this relationship. Okay, and so we're already starting to get into the topic of homosexuality. So let's explicitly say, okay, that's our topic now. That we're gonna talk about homosexuality in Greek culture. So the Symposium itself is important evidence for how the Greeks, and of course particularly how the Athenians, looked at homosexuality. Right. It's one of many sources we have, but it's an important source in its own right. So hopefully it can teach us something about what the Greeks thought of homosexuality. You can tell that it's a prominent practice. I mean, it's highlighted, obviously, in the text, but it's also precarious in a way because people are arguing about it. And you can tell in the text that some people think it should be outlawed, or we should get rid of it, or it should be constrained in various ways. But at the same time, obviously, it's important because it's this big topic of conversation. And so the attitudes are ambivalent, obviously, right? And it seems like Plato thinks homosexuality could play an important role in education, but then there have to be some constraints on it, and so we'll say more about that as the speeches unfold, because Plato is telling us through the speeches what he thinks the role should be. Although I also have to note that in a very late work called The Laws, Plato said that homosexuality, homosexual relations among people of the same age should be outlawed. So that's quite a striking statement from him, but somewhat in line with this idea that there's some place for it in education, right? And so you expect an age difference between the lovers, between the lover and the beloved, I should say. It is interesting that, as far as we can tell, the word lesbian, or the ancient Greek term that means lesbian, was coined in this text. We don't see it in any earlier texts. So maybe Plato came up with the word. So there's an older Greek term pronounced hetairoi, and I'm not a Greek scholar, as I've mentioned, but something like hetairoi means female companions. That's not yet the word that means lesbian, and so that word gets modified here into hetairistrii, and that means lesbians. That's the plural. Hetairistria would be the particular case, the individual. So that's interesting that maybe the word lesbian is coined here for the first time, although obviously male homosexuality dominates as a topic, and it's for various reasons, and partly because of the educative function of it, or at least that's often what the speeches turn on. Okay, so I already mentioned issues about age, which was supposed to be my next topic. I will say this. This is something I wrote down in connection with age. So I already said Plato sort of outlaws, basically, same-sex homosexual relationships in the laws. Aristotle also frowns on such relationships, but it's odd because in his work, The Politics, he highlights a number of relationships in which you've got two men, and they're close in age at least, and Aristotle talks about them in positive terms, talks about how they were able to gain and wield political power, and he doesn't pause to offer any critical commentary about that. So he at least realizes that this is a normal thing in the Greek world, but then at the same time, it's in some areas, in some portions of his texts, wants to outlaw it, apparently. Okay, so there's this relationship, it seems, between the prominence of homosexuality and homoeroticism and the gender inequality that we see in Greek society, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that for the ancient Greeks, public life is very important, and you know that they're very into virtue. We've already figured that out. And the Greeks tend to distinguish between private virtue and civic virtue. Right? You could be virtuous in your private life, but it's more important to have civic virtue, to be virtuous in your public life, right? So for the Greeks, the public is everything. In a way, that's reality for them. Whatever actually takes place in the public sphere, that's what's real. I suppose it's the opposite of what we tend to think in our culture. In private life, that's when you get real. But the Greeks maybe have this performative view of reality, the way we actually perform for each other out in public. That's our real selves. Those are the selves we're constructing for each other. So that's what we value. So that's what's real. Okay, so anyway, because of the strong gender inequality here, women can't really participate in civic virtue. They can barely leave their houses once they're married, right? When women are out in public, they're often prostitutes or slaves or entertainers, right? We heard that list earlier. That's the list of types of women allowed to participate in the symposium. You didn't want to let your wives or your daughters out in public. Someone might grab them, do something to them. They were sort of on lockdown in a way. It's bad. I don't care for it. But that's how it was. And my point here is, so women couldn't really play a role, take part in public virtue or civic virtue. So that left men jostling with each other to gobble up the civic virtue. And of course, alliances are important and can be powerful. So if the men are jostling with each other and the women aren't around, won't men often do better if they form alliances? Yes, of course. If there's sexual attraction, could that form the basis of a powerful alliance? Yes, it could. And I believe that's part of why these homosexual relationships are so important in Aristotle's politics. A lot of homosexuals had success in navigating political life in ancient Greece. And I think it has something to do with the gender inequality at the end of the day. And then you might also think, I guess I'll neither insist on it nor deny it. You might also think, well, men have a lot of libidinal energy anyway, a lot of sexual energy. If you banish the women, they might flirt with each other, and things could go from there. Okay, so now we get to the framing of the dialogue, and the main thing I want to say about the framing is that it's quite indirect, and so we need to notice that and comment on it. So the way the dialogue starts, right, is Apollodorus runs in to someone who he calls Glaucon, but we don't we're not sure which Glaucon we're really talking about here. So he runs into someone, and this Glaucon wants to know about some event, some symposium of times past. He wants to know about the speeches that were given there. It seems like this person is kind of a business person interested in making money. That seems to be something that emerges from the conversation between Apollodorus and this other gentleman. And then, of course, Apollodorus is crazy about philosophy, and he's one of these young men, frankly, who followed Socrates around. So the guy addressing him, Glaucon, figures Apollodorus knows all about the speeches, and especially about Socrates' speech, and wants to know about them for his own purposes, even though he's not a great philosophy enthusiast, apparently. But then Apollodorus wasn't there. He's too young to have been there, right? But he was just talking, by coincidence, he was just talking to Aristodemus, and Aristodemus was following Socrates around at that time, at the time of the symposium at issue. And so Aristodemus has told Apollodorus about what happened there and about the speeches that were given. So again, we've got some serious indirectness. We've got the symposium itself, and Aristodemus was there, it seems, but didn't give a speech, or we don't have any record of the speech. And so Aristodemus, who couldn't even account for his own speech, since he apparently didn't give one, reported things to Apollodorus, right? And so Apollodorus is already getting secondhand information, because Aristodemus is reporting on other people's speeches. And then Apollodorus is telling Glaucon what Aristodemus told him, and so, it's getting to Glaucon third hand at best. So why the indirectness? Well, there seem to be different reasons for it. So in Diotima's speech, she refers to some mysteries, and so we have to show reverence for the mysteries, right? They're the mysteries of love that come up in the speech, and the indirectness would be a way of showing reverence. We're not going to come right at the mysteries surrounding love, but we're going to gently approach. So we will use an indirect approach to keep it gentle. There seems to be some idea like that going on. Another thing that's almost certainly going on is that this is a Platonic dialogue, as I've said, and yet Socrates is the one delivering metaphysical doctrines here, right? So this could be a way of Plato shielding Socrates a bit and admitting that these aren't really Socrates' views, right? I mean, when Socrates talks, there's the questioning of Agathon. That's Socrates, right? And that's a typical Socratic way to proceed. So that's all Socrates. That's on him when he questions Agathon. But then when he gives a speech, he's really giving Diotima's speech, as I've already mentioned. So there's another bit of indirectness there. So there's a distancing here. Plato is trying to distance Socrates from the metaphysical views that he puts in Socrates' mouth, or that's how it appears, right? So that's two different functions played by the indirectness, it seems. Okay, now we're getting to the point where we want to talk about the speeches. but I'll start by saying that the speeches follow a certain pattern. I've already mentioned that, this is a cultural practice. This has a long history by the time we get to this specific symposium, right? There's a long history to it. So they're giving a certain kind of speech that's well known that we could call a eulogy, or we could call it an encomium. Those are basically synonyms. So either word would be fine. And then Christopher Gill, in that penguin introduction that I mentioned earlier, he tells us 5 things that the eulogy should include. And once you are aware of these elements, then you can see the speech givers follow the pattern, right? So the eulogy, should include, number 1, the origin or genealogy of the subject, or noble birth, right? So the subject, of course, should be lofty, so there should be a good or noble origin at issue here. Number 2, good qualities other than virtues. We're leading up to virtues. We want to have these other good qualities first, such as strength and beauty. And then, of course, number 3, virtues, such as wisdom, justice, courage, and practices that win reputation. There are 5 elements, so notice virtues is in the middle, sort of, playing the central role, I guess we could say. Prominent, maybe the most important part. Number 4, habits and way of life. Number 5, achievements of the subject by contrast with those of others, right? What are the distinctive achievements of the subject, in other words? And the eulogists, or the speech givers, they typically assume reciprocity between God and humans, which is very not Euthyphro, by the way. We know this already. But the people participating here, they expect some reciprocity, so they're going to speak really well about the gods, and then, of course, the gods are going to give them favors in return, like a sort of exchange that was talked about and rejected in the Euthyphro, because, what would we give the gods, right? As Socrates points out, do we really have anything that would benefit them that we could give them? But anyway, of course, there's a difference between the philosophical view of the gods espoused by Socrates, and then the more conventional view. And so I'm just saying these are conventional speeches, and according to convention, there's a reciprocity, right? So you praise the gods and you get good stuff in return. Okay, so that brings us to the speech of Phaedrus. Phaedrus emphasizes 1 and 5 from our list. In other words, he emphasizes the noble birth of Eros, and he emphasizes the achievements of Eros. So Phaedrus gives love an ancient pedigree. He says love was the 3rd god to come into being after chaos and earth, or chaos and Gaia, we could say. And then love's achievement, we'll keep seeing different riffs on this. Love's achievement is to promote virtue among human beings. And in particular, Phaedrus holds that love promotes courage, right? That virtue specifically. He says at 179b, no one will die for you but a lover, right? That's the active party, I'll remind you. So he says no one will die for you but a lover, and so that reflects well on Eros, who is the one getting the lover going, excited, whatever. And yet, Phaedrus gives examples of beloveds dying for their lovers, right? So Alcestis is Admetus's wife, and she's willing to die for her husband, right? Whoever it is, Hades comes to take Admetus away, and Alcestis offers herself. He says, "You can take me instead." So she's a beloved who's willing to die for her lover. And Achilles dies to avenge Patroclus, right? And then Phaedrus suggests that Achilles is the beloved, right? So those are two examples of the beloved having courage. So that's an interesting juxtaposition, I guess. We could say explicitly Phaedrus is saying no one will die for you but a lover, but then when we get examples of beloveds offering themselves up. So I'm sure there's an implicit lesson here. I was going to say there's probably an implicit lesson. I suppose there's definitely an implicit lesson. We could talk about what it probably is. I believe Phaedrus is suggesting there is more reciprocity in the relationship than is conventionally assumed, right? Of course, the beloveds are benefiting from the relationship, and they're being inspired, and they're growing in virtue. And so, on the one hand, we could praise the lover, but then on the other hand, look at how the beloveds are getting the virtue from the relationship, and they're showing their virtue by offering themselves up, offering their lives, and putting those on the line. Okay, so that's all we need to say about Phaedrus' speech. So then we come to Pausanias, okay? And I would say, well, scholars other than me also would say that this speech puts on prominent display the conventional understanding of the homosexual relationship in ancient Greece, right? So in other words, we're getting into that educative function here. Pausanias wants to make a big deal out of it, and then that makes sense biographically because Pausanias is Agathon's lover. Or in other words, just to be clear, Agathon is Pausanias' beloved. That's the kind of relationship they have. I don't know that they're far apart in age, but Pausanias is the older party and is presumed, well, I don't know. I've already brought it up, so it's presumed to have the active role, in other words, but that can be read in more than one way. Active in educating, right, is one take on that. Active in giving the virtue rather than receiving the virtue. Okay, so Pausanias distinguishes two kinds of love, and then that also gets riffed on as we keep going. And I believe this is a common thing that happens at these symposia. Somebody introduces a theme, and then others take it up again and modify it. I'm sure that was a normal thing that happened. So it happens here as well. Pausanias distinguishes between common love and heavenly love, using the genealogies of the gods that the poets created to justify that, but we don't need to get into that. We just need to say, okay, well, there's common love and there's heavenly love. Common love is purely physical. And so, this is the way he puts it. And so it could be aroused by a woman, just as well as a man or a boy. Now, heavenly love, so common love directed at the body, heavenly love directed at the soul. And so heavenly love is only directed at those who can be perfected. It's directed at those whose souls can be brought to a certain level of cognitive and ethical refinement. So then for Pausanias, it's important that the boy be old enough, in other words, right? So, someone who can be educated, who can benefit from an education. So Pausanias would insist that the boy be pubescent, at least, I guess, to be blunt about it, right? Not too young. And we get a lot of interesting cultural information from Pausanias here, right? So according to him, at least in Athens, the lover is greatly encouraged, right? People root for the lover, and the lover might do outrageous things, like sleep on the beloved's doorstep, and people will cheer him on. Yeah, go get your beloved. Do what you need to do. And then at the same time, the Athenians discouraged the beloved. When a boy of a well-off family got to a certain age, they might literally hire a bodyguard. The word attendant is appropriate here, but that person is acting as a sort of bodyguard, trying to keep older men away. So you might get a bodyguard, and people would shame a beloved, or a candidate beloved, a potential beloved, if it looked like he might give in to the lover. So they would encourage the lover, go get your beloved, and then they would sort of shame the beloved if it looked like he might give in. Hey, come on, just ignore that guy. What are you doing? You got your own life to live. Just forget about this guy. He's too much. Stay away from him. He's trouble. Right? You know what he wants. So just stay away. Again, interesting juxtaposition. What Pausanias gets out of that is that the Athenians value these relationships, but they've set things up so that there can be some confidence that the lover is manifesting heavenly love and not common love, right? And so that distinction then is very important. You've got to keep the older guy at bay until things are clear, right? We've got to get some clarity on what this guy really wants. Okay, and Plato is certainly critiquing the conventional view here to some extent. He's not presenting it in a neutral way. Right, so Pausanias sort of puts forward this relationship as if it might be an exchange, sort of different things. So the older guy is going to get some sexual gratification, and the younger guy is going to get virtue. And the subtext seems to be that is not a good trade. I mean, it becomes more explicit later in the text, but even here, the subtext seems to be, well, that's not a good trade. Shouldn't they both be interested in virtue? And wouldn't that be an appropriate relationship, right? Why does either of them seek sexual gratification as a primary goal of the relationship? Plato's not saying it shouldn't be any goal at all, but he's down on it being a primary goal, I would say. Okay, and then we get to Eryximachus' speech. Eryximachus is a doctor, and that's a prominent theme in the text. He plays the role of doctor. He tries to help Aristophanes get over his hiccups. And that part of the text comes across as over the top. Okay, and I think Eryximachus is being made fun of a little bit. And the point isn't probably to make fun of the person Eryximachus. Um, Plato is a little down on doctors, it seems. He seems to think they're too focused on the bodies and they need to pay more attention to the soul. He's not saying they shouldn't pay attention to the body, but Plato apparently thinks, as far as I can make out from the Symposium, that medicine needs to be more holistic, pay more attention to the inner spiritual life, to the soul, that sort of thing. So the speech Eryximachus, gives is a bit awkward. Harmony is one of the most important themes in the speech, and then at the same time, there are different elements in the speech that seem to be awkwardly combined. You're a bit surprised where it ends, given where it began. It doesn't come together very well. So Plato is making fun again, I think. Harmony is being thematized, and yet the speech isn't harmonious. And then presumably that's a comment on the state of medicine at the time, rather than, again, Eryximachus, the person. Okay, so what does Eryximachus say in the speech? He accepts the distinction that Pausanias made between heavenly and common love, though he puts the distinction in his own terms. So he mentions the heavenly muses, and he contrasts two different muses. There's the honorable heavenly species of love produced by Urania, the heavenly muse. And then there's the common and vulgar species of love produced by Polyhymnia, the muse of many songs. And there's a Greek trope here that I could point out to you. The ancient Greeks definitely thought simplicity was best, right? And so you've got Urania, who certainly in contrast with Polyhymnia would seem to be devoted to one song, or at least one kind of song, maybe a holy song, maybe a worship song, versus Polyhymnia, right? Muse of many songs. The Greeks always thought simplicity was best, so Urania is the better muse, the more heavenly muse. And in the Greek mind, this would be related to the distinction between mind and body, right? So the heavenly muse, Urania, who is simple, who has a simple song or is connected to a simple song, she would also be connected to the soul because the soul doesn't have parts. The soul is simple. And then, of course, the body is an organism, and so it's naturally divided into organs, into parts, right? So the body naturally goes with Polyhymnia, right? So then, not surprisingly, Urania, heavenly love, again, would be focused on the soul and the mind. Polyhymnia, with her attachment to many kinds of songs, would be focused on the body. Okay. As I've already suggested, Eryximachus broadens the notion of love that they've been talking about, making it into a cosmic force. He says it regulates the seasons as well as the human body. So that's fine. It does start to get a little vague. He broadens the notion of eros so much that you might not be sure what the topic of discussion is anymore. And again, that's where the speech starts to lose some coherence, some harmony, right? Number 3, Eryximachus makes love out to be an important notion in medicine. He claims that there are moderate loves or desires operating in the human body, and then there are intemperate loves or desires operating in the human body. And of course you could gratify the temperate loves or desires, but you would want to deny the intemperate ones, right? Greek medicine, obviously, not the same, not the same as contemporary medicine. In Greek medicine, you have the idea that a body is made healthy by being filled and emptied in the right way. You put the right things into it, get the right things out of it. That's how you know the body is healthy. And it's not like we would deny that, but that's not our primary notion of what counts as health. But it is, in Greek medicine, the primary notion of what counts as health. And so it would make sense for Eryximachus to let desire play this prominent role, especially the temperate desires versus the intemperate ones, because filling the body and emptying the body is so important in health, at least for the ancient Greeks again. Okay, then we get to Aristophanes' speech, which is a lot of fun. You remember Aristophanes. He's a playwright. He's known for making fun of Socrates, right? That comes up in the Apology. So Aristophanes says there used to be these 3 kinds of human beings. There were males, females, and the androgynous, right? And they were all what we would think of as doubles, but they wouldn't think of themselves that way, right? So the shape of each human being was completely round, says Aristophanes, with back and sides in a circle. This is at 189e. If you want to look at this, the phrasing is a bit weird, I think. But, you know, you can tell that they're joined back to back, although the genitals aren't where you would expect them to be, that they get moved later, right? And Aristophanes says they walked upright as we do, but when they wanted to go fast, they spun around like a gymnast doing cartwheels. So if they wanted to go fast, they would sort of roll, something like that. So the male, or what Aristophanes would just say is the male, they're called the children of the sun, right? That's just a Greek trope, right? The male is associated with light, and so associated with the sun. The female people were children of the earth, and then the male-female, or the mixed species, the androgynous, they were children of the moon, right? Obviously the moon is a lit-up earthy body, so you can see how that's appropriate. And so according to Aristophanes, the humans were strong and they were powerful, they were ambitious, they eventually tried to overthrow the gods. The gods didn't want to completely destroy them because they liked being worshipped and they liked getting sacrifices from the humans. Again, echoes of Euthyphro and what's wrong with conventional Greek beliefs there. Anyway, for those reasons, allegedly, ostensibly, the gods didn't want to completely destroy the humans, so then Zeus said, okay, well, we'll just weaken them, we'll split them in half, right? And they'll be less powerful. Okay, and then if they run riot again, he says, we'll split them in half again, and they can just hop around on one leg and have just one eye, and so on. Right, so Zeus splits them in half, and then Hephaestus, right, or, well, the text says Apollo. I would guess Hephaestus because he is a craftsman, but okay. So Zeus and Apollo work to put the humans back together, and so they separate them and then put their skin back together, and they move their heads in such a way that they can look down at their navels, right? Okay, and this is sort of the origin story of the navel. So this is a wound from the separation, right? And it's supposed to remind us of hubris, which is a sort of typical Greek lesson. Oh, remember when we tried to overthrow the gods, and then we got split in half? So I like this as a myth. This is a really nice myth that Plato has put into Aristophanes' mouth here. So he clearly thinks highly of Aristophanes, despite the trouble with Socrates. Okay, and then the rest, will sound very familiar. It's very intuitive. So you've got these separated halves, and they're sad, and they miss each other. They feel incomplete. And so they go around and they try to find each other. And when they find each other, they embrace. And sometimes they don't know when to stop, right? They embrace, and they just lie there, and they get hungry, and they're exposed to the elements, and they don't move, and so sometimes they just die. And so Zeus gets this idea of turning their genitals around to the front, and so now they could have intercourse with each other face to face instead of in the ground. There's this idea that, well, earlier they were just putting their sperm and their eggs into the ground, and things were growing out of the ground, right? But now we'll turn their genitals around, and they can have intercourse, and then they'll feel really good, and they'll quit longing for each other for a little while, and then they can be productive, right? Which is an interesting thing that comes up here. We can't have them, just totally idle, pining away after each other. They can just have sex and be done with it, and then they can sort of get back to their everyday affairs, right? And obviously, children of the sun long for men, and children of the moon long for women. And I didn't say that right. I said the first part right. Children of the sun long for men. Children of the earth long for women. Children of the moon long for the opposite sex, right? And so on. And so you get a sort of theory of sexual orientation here, which is a bit surprising. We do think of the notion of sexual orientation as being anachronistic, right? We don't want to foist it on people who didn't share our ideas of sexual orientation, but we're getting something like that here, right? That seems to be what this is an explanation of the tendency of some people to be interested in the same sex sexually, and the tendency of other people to be interested in the opposite sex. Aristophanes has a take on how that came to be. And then I'll also say in that vein, in connection with that, Aristophanes says that Pausanias and Agathon are probably children of the sun, right? So again, that's just interesting. So in a sense, he's saying they're gay, they're homosexual, though that idea of sexual orientation doesn't exist yet. But here it is in rudimentary form anyway. Okay, so the upshot of the speech here is love is this force created by Zeus. It's not exactly a gift from the gods. He wasn't trying to give us this gift. It just happened because we had hubris and he punished us. But it's divine. It's got a divine origin, which is important because we're giving eulogies here. So love needs to have a divine origin or a noble birth. Love gives us power, right? That's part of the upshot here. It energizes us. It makes us get out in the world and be ambitious. We want to go find our other half. So love is a strong motive force that's productive in our lives. Although at the same time, when we actually have sex, we're not we're not being productive in the business sense, I guess. However, as is noted in the speech, you have sex, you get it out of the way, and now you can go back to business. I should also say, looking forward to the speech that Socrates gives, the people who experience love, they don't know what they want. They don't know what they're aimed at. They don't know what love is moving them toward, right? So Hephaestus, now Hephaestus plays a role, hypothetically comes and asks the lovers, hey, do you want me to weld you together forever? And then they say, oh, that's a good idea. But they didn't think of it themselves. They didn't know they wanted to be one. They didn't know they wanted to be united forever. So I think that's interesting. Even in the speech that Aristophanes gives, you could be in love and not really know where that's headed, right? And that's an important point for Socrates when he gives his speech. Also, I've mentioned that Eryximachus and Socrates make love out to be this cosmic force. Aristophanes doesn't quite do that. Love is either interpersonal, or you could even say it's intrapersonal sometimes if they get welded together, right? But love emerged from a cosmic struggle between mortals and gods. So not quite a cosmic force, but still embedded in the context of a cosmic struggle. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second, and then we'll talk about Agathon's speech, and then that will be it for this video. Okay, now we move into Agathon's speech. This is the last thing we want to look at in this video, right? We're working up to Socrates' speech, but we're not covering that in this video. Agathon is a pupil of Gorgias, and that's very important in understanding the whole point of the speech. There's the internal point of the speech, and there's the external point. The internal point, of course, is to praise eros. The external point, in other words, the author's point, rather than Agathon's point, would seem to be to criticize Gorgias, right? Because here's his pupil, and his pupil gives this terrible speech. It's beautiful. It's nice to read. The beauty comes across in the English translation. But conceptually, it's bad. Argumentatively, it's very poorly executed. Right? So that's the kind of thing that Gorgias taught students to do, is to give bad arguments that were beautiful. right? Or at least that's what Plato is clearly getting at. And then Socrates does take Agathon to task, and he begins to show that Agathon's got it all wrong and isn't being logical and isn't tracking the truth, right? And it's not Agathon's fault. Agathon isn't portrayed as a villain or anything, but implicitly Gorgias is being portrayed as a villain. So we'll go through the speech, and I'll criticize it as we go through it, because I do think the criticism of Gorgias is definitely one of the main points of the speech. Right? It does forward some themes. It does keep the narrative moving forward and progressing. But as I've said, the author's point here, the external point outside of the structure of the narrative and everything, is really to criticize Gorgias. Okay, so let's get to it. So Agathon starts with the origin, as he's supposed to do, right? So he goes in order. He says something about the origin of the god. He says something about the good attributes of eros. He says something about the virtues that eros has, and then something like maybe the way of life of eros. So anyway, we start with the origin. We start conventionally. What he says about that is that eros is the youngest of gods. And not only is eros the youngest god now, but perpetually eros is the youngest god. He stays young over time. What's the reason? Well, there's a principle, or at least people sometimes use this as a principle, that like attracts like. Like is drawn to like. Right? And love shows up among the young. The young tend to fall in love. In the text, certainly these older men are drawn to younger men who are sexually blooming. And so love has something to do with youth, right? And so eros should be eternally young. So that's argument by association, right? That doesn't work at all. So basically what Agathon is saying is that love is around young people all the time, so love has to be young. Okay, so that it sounds nice the way Agathon puts it, but it, argumentatively it doesn't work. And maybe to some extent it's not supposed to. Agathon hasn't prepared a speech for this evening. He might be clowning around a bit, having some fun. There's some suggestion of that the speech isn't meant entirely seriously, but we also have to face the fact that these are bad arguments. There are a lot of arguments here, and they're all bad. So the next point is another associative point. Eros walks in people's souls and characters, and those are soft. So then eros, or love, has to be delicate and soft. I think that association is worse than the first one, because at least in the first one we were talking about literal youth, but now we're talking about souls and characters being soft, and that's not meant literally. So we're trying to say that love hangs around characters and souls which are only figuratively soft, and so then love is delicate and soft in a literal way, I guess. So that starts to seem like nonsense. It's hard to even say anything sensible about that. The next point is similar. Love has a fluid and supple shape. Why? Because it can enfold a soul. It can completely enclose a soul, and it can get in and out of the soul without the soul noticing. Okay, I mean, can the soul be enfolded? Where is the soul? Is the soul thought to be physical here, or aren't we just being figurative again? And aren't we trying to say that love is literally this way because it's associated with the soul, which is figuratively like this? So, yeah, it's hard to do anything with that. It's hard to even formulate a definite argument that could be criticized. So I'll just move on. Here's another associative point. Love has beautifully colored skin, for he constantly consorts with flowers. And by flowers, we actually mean the bloom on youths. So now we have to explain what that means. So again, love is beautifully colored because love is around flowers, but which flowers do we mean? So young people, as they're coming to sexual maturity, are said to have a bloom. This is a common Greek thing. It comes up in Aristotle as well. So Aristotle and Plato refer to the bloom of youth, and other Greeks did as well. So that's just a special attractiveness that someone is supposed to have when they're coming into their own, when they're sexually mature, suddenly, finally, after some time. This is all muddled, of course. Once again, love has a beautifully colored skin, because love is around flowers, so that's association. But again, well, we don't mean literal flowers. We're talking about the bloom of youth. So it's cute. I don't know what else to call it. It's like a cute bundle of associations. You could be impressed with the skillfulness of the associations and the way they're woven together, but it's not informative, right? Which again, Socrates will point out. Okay, so those are the good qualities that aren't virtues, and then we get to the virtues. Okay, so love is just. Why is love just? Well, people willingly give in to love. Love doesn't have to coerce anybody. So love isn't unfair in that way. There are a couple of problems there. Well, doesn't love just kind of overwhelm your will and your volition? If you're like really in love, it can be overwhelming. So sure, you're not coerced, but maybe you're not in control of yourself either. Also, this is a negative point. Love does not, that's the negation. Love does not coerce, therefore love is just. Well, what does justice positively do? And does love do that? Really doubtful, right? So there's a couple problems with that inference. Love is moderate, for moderation is power over pleasures, and love overpowers other pleasures. So this is literally saying that love is moderate because it's overpowering other things. So that's a contradiction on the face of it. Moderation is not being extreme, right? Taking a moderate middle path. So you can't say love is moderate because it overpowers other things. That doesn't work. Love is brave. Why is love brave? Because Aphrodite has a hold on Ares rather than the other way around. Ares wanted to have this affair with Aphrodite because she had a hold on him. And so they were sneaking around trying to avoid getting caught by Hephaestus. So then Aphrodite is superior to Ares, who is brave. There are a couple different ways the argument it maybe is supposed to work, but it's not. It's so bad that it's not clear how it's supposed to work. One way to look at it is Aphrodite is superior to Ares, and Ares is known for bravery, so Aphrodite must have even more bravery than Ares. I don't know, maybe that's what Agathon means. The other possibility is that Ares was inspired by Aphrodite to be brave because he was having this affair, even though Hephaestus would want to kill him if he found out. I mean, none of this works, so I don't really know what Agathon was trying to say. As far as Aphrodite like being superior to Ares, well, she didn't need to be for them to have an affair. She just needed to be attractive. I mean, I guess they're just having an affair. They're not setting up a life together. So, it's really just about physical attraction. So, okay, so what did she do? She just needed to be attractive. Superiority and inferiority has nothing to do with it. She hasn't got the better of him in any literal way. And then as far as her inspiring Ares to be brave goes, well, she's not, she's not the same person as Eros, so I don't know that works. Isn't Eros inspiring Ares so that Ares goes after Aphrodite? Anyway, it's all association and wordplay, so I better quit talking about it. I'm just getting annoyed. Sorry. Love is wise. Why is love wise? Well, the main reason, there are a few points here, but the main reason is, well, we like to write poetry when we're in love. Some of us do. So we suddenly become poets. We suddenly gain this skill of making poetry. So you see, love is wise because love is putting wisdom into us. Okay, love doesn't make us good poets. I'll tell you what I would say. Here's what I'll grant to the argument. Love is motivational, and we want to do things to impress the one we love. So we might have the motivation to develop skills as a result of our love, but it's not going to give us wisdom directly. We're not going to be good poets because we're in love. It takes discipline and practice to be a good poet. As far as I can tell, I'm not a good poet, but I've studied poets and the development of poets. I've tracked certain poets over their lifetime and sort of seen the course of development and how that goes. And that is my impression of things for what it's worth, that skill comes from discipline and practice and some innate talent, I'm sure. Okay. So those are a lot of bad arguments, and it culminates in this point at 197c, if you want to look, that, quote, all goods came to gods and men alike through love of beauty, end quote. So we had to work up to this grand point. Well, all good stuff comes from love, and love of beauty specifically. And it's funny because Socrates says something like that himself, but he cashes it out. I mean, he provides some evidence that it's true. When Agathon says it, you just think, okay, It would be interesting if you gave me any evidence. I don't know. It's a nice sentiment, right? If there's no evidence behind it, then I guess it's just a nice sentiment, and that's it. And I said I'd read the end of the speech. It's pretty. Let's read it and experience the prettiness together. This is 197D now. Love fills us with togetherness and drains all of our divisiveness away. Love calls gatherings like these together. In feasts, in dances, and in ceremonies, he gives the lead. Love moves us to mildness, removes from us wildness. He is giver of kindness, never of meanness. Gracious, kindly, let wise men see and gods admire. Treasure to lovers, envy to others. Father of elegance, luxury, delicacy, grace, yearning, desire. Love cares well for good men, cares not for bad ones. In pain, in fear, in desire or speech, love is our best guide and guard. He is our comrade and our savior, ornament of all gods and men, most beautiful leader and the best. Every man should follow love, sing beautifully his hymns, and join with him in the song he sings that charms the mind of God or man. By convention, that's way of life and habit, if anything. It's nice. It's a lot of other beautiful associations, and they're not even in the form of an argument, so it's not that offensive. It's fun to read, right? So love is associated with all these good things, and that's how it exists and lives, and so that's why I think of it as saying something about the way of life. Okay, so main point here for me with respect to Agathon's speech is, as I already said, it's meant to put Gorgias in a bad light. It's also meant to bring out, by contrast, how wonderful Socrates' speech is. And this connects with things we've said about Socrates before. His speaking style isn't polished, but he's guided by the truth, and that's what he says about himself in the Apology, as I hope you'll recall. And then Agathon is the opposite, right? You get nothing but polish, right? So the speech is pretty on the outside, empty on the inside. Socrates' speech is ugly on the outside, or there are claims that it is anyway, but beautiful on the inside, and that's because it's tracking the truth. And truth and beauty are thought to be entwined here. Okay, so that's enough for this video and this week, and next week we'll have a video on the rest of the symposium. Thank you.